Today, we can say that Buddhism is a reality in the Western society, a present able to express a worldview, values, and proposals that can contribute to building a more just and open society. Although a few decades of presence in Europe may seem short compared to Buddhism's millennium-long history in the world, they actually confirm a living, modern present that is able to speak without hesitation on important issues, above all, to offer fundamental tools of practice, reflection, and care for contemporary humanity in search of a spirituality it can relate to.
What I think is one of the great strengths of Buddhism in Europe, and that is its diversity. In other words, if we go to a particular country in Asia, most Buddhists of that country will belong to a particular tradition and school or schools. What's happening in modernity and in the West in general, or one might, I think now say globally, is that Buddhists are getting to meet each other. And in Europe, we have the situation where in pretty much any major European city today, within a few minutes or more, you can find yourself in a Theravada vihara, in a Tibetan Buddhist center, in a zendo, in a meeting of the Soka Gakkai, in any number of different Buddhist communities that have sprung up. And historically, this is very unusual. It's a feature of modernity that people are able to travel and to move around so easily. But the consequence of it is that Buddhists no longer find themselves just within the frame of their own traditions, and that they are inevitably going to encounter forms of Buddhist thought and practice that they may not really have come across before. There's always the temptation to withdraw into the protective shell of your own school, and I think there are times in one's training when that's a good thing, to be honest. But at the same time, as one's practice matures, you are confronted with the fact that not all Buddhists think the same.
One of the assets that probably we have vis-a-vis the earlier historical condition in Europe or in so-called Western Buddhism is that actually we can come to a more meaningful self-reflection and understanding of our own Buddhist identity and identities as constructed identities. So maybe emerging from this Buddhist modernist paradigm into this and fully acknowledging the impact of postmodernist ideologies on the shaping of our own identities, and somehow really understanding that we are conditioned in the way we self-reflect on ourselves as Buddhist practitioners or agents. So I think this sense of non-identification with one's own inheritance, be it traditional or modernist or postmodernist or whatever that is an asset that we can have.
You know, science and technology, interesting. They're all about causality, right? Finding out how to explain how everything happens. This is the causal project. The modern Western scientific project is figuring out what are the immutable laws of nature, such that if you know the initial conditions of something, you can predict everything that will happen after that. That's the holy grail of Western science. Find those immutable laws, and from any initial conditions, you can discover what will happen next. Well, guess what? That's not a very Buddhist way of understanding causality, because there's this tension with the idea that if you had such a world, if we lived in such a world, and as the interlocutors of the Buddha were saying in his lifetime, hey, you talk about karma, the Buddha, you talk about karma, you talk about an infinite past, an infinitely deep past, a cosmos without a beginning. That means that we've had an infinite amount of time to make bad karma. If we've had an infinite amount of time to make bad karma, then there's no way to work your way through all that infinite amount of bad karma. Therefore, enlightenment is possible in your terms. And the Buddha's response was, you misunderstand karma entirely. The whole point about karma is that it is not a deterministic system about the world. It's a non-deterministic emergent order. We have a role to play in that. Our karma is a function of our values, our intentions, and the way in which we enact those values and intentions. So Daniel Dennett. And impersonal. unreflective, robotic, mindless little scrap of molecular machinery is the ultimate basis of all the agency and hence meaning and hence consciousness in the universe. Now, Buddhists are not about blind belief in anything. So you can't really, I don't think, have Buddhist heresy because there's not that kind of doctrine. But if anything comes close to Buddhist heresy, that statement is Buddhist heresy. Why? Because it says you have no agency. Free will is an illusion. Changing your karma, forget it. You cannot. It's just a mindless, unreflective, robotic, molecular machinery that's playing out over time. And that's it. Get used to it. And Dennett's not alone in this. There are many, many people in the scientific world that feel the same way. So one of the things that I think is incumbent upon us as Buddhists in the 21st century is to go to scientists and say, your views are limited. So I think in much the same way that scientists have realized that Newtonian physics works perfectly well at a certain range of phenomena. 70% of all the things that we observe in the universe, you can explain with Newtonian physics. But then there's another 20% that you need relativity physics, and for which you need quantum physics. And I think Buddhism says, Western science, you're really good. 90% of what's going on in the observed universe, you can handle. Perfect, 100% right, 90% of the time. But what Buddhism offers is a reflection on that 10%. Because what science today tells us is what the observed universe is doing and gives no account whatsoever for the observing universe. If you took away the observing universe, that is consciousness, mentality, free will, you take that out of the equation, what is left of the cosmos? Nothing.
We say that we live in a postmodern era that is after the modernist era. So modernism was about rationality, science, ethics, justice, universal narratives. And then postmodernity followed, and it destroyed the values of modernity by fragmentation, by relativity, by no real truth, all these notions, and by basically no values, we would say. So if that's true, and we may live in a postmodern era now, what is coming next? And here I would say again, maybe a circulation would help, or a mutual constraints idea would help. And when I was thinking about it, I came up with a term, and then I found that this term exists already, luckily. And this term is transmodernism. It was created in 1989 already by a Spanish philosopher, a lady, Rosa Maria Rodriguez Magda. And she used this term to bring the best of modernity and postmodernity together and transcend them by creating a new way of thinking. And I would propose that this new way of thinking would be addressed in the context of Buddhism as well. And what is transmodernity in that sense? What is transmodernism in that sense? It includes circulation and constraints as a principle, basically dialogue as a principle. It accepts multiple identities, although we know as Buddhists that they don't exist, but still they are conventional realities and temporary, let's say, approximations to the meaning of life and to who we are. So they exist in a way, although we know that they are not the final truths. And then two important, very important aspects are included in this view, surpassing modernity and surpassing postmodernity. One is spirituality, the spiritual perspective of reality, that there must that a non-reductionist, non-materialistic view on experience is needed, and this is expressed by more and more people, luckily. And the last one, I mean, there are many more, of course, but the last important one, most important one, is the ecological perspective, ecological awareness, that we are interdependent, not only between us as human beings, between societies, but also between human life and natural life, or life as such. And I think that would and could probably be the future of Buddhism, including all life, including all cultures, including all perspectives, including all gateways to the mystery that resides at the center.
Especially young people, we are constantly bombarded with, esoteric practices, or at least parts of it, with like pop psychology and new age ideas through social media mainly. And these snippets of spiritual practice, they don't really offer tools for inner transformation. They don't really offer a deep path. So if we are not careful, I think we run the risk that Buddhism becomes limited to something like just a mindfulness exercise or some self-help. We are facing a time of deep uncertainty, climate anxiety, economic instability, and maybe the biggest of all for young people is loneliness and breakdown of community and belonging. So this, again, is, I think, where Buddhism can catch those people facing these fears, because it offers a practice without punishment. Buddhism, when in its birthing hour, it was already a revolutionary way of practicing spirituality, because the Buddha included women in the monastic order. He rejected the caste system. He rejected ritual animal sacrifices. In our opinion, a very modern idea, and this is exactly where Buddhism aligns with this need for science, or the scientific spirit that we have in Europe.
I think Buddhism is universal in the sense that it can include and encompass multiple perspectives and views, and can circulate or initiate a circulatory dialogue between those views, whether they are views of science or humanities, or particular worldviews or ideologies that I mentioned. And that helped me also to understand what this dichotomy between modernity and postmodernity could mean, and how it could be surpassed by a newer view that could benefit from both, while tackling the challenges that they posed and surpassing them with a newer view that includes what I have just said before, a more spiritual perspective about the meaning of life and reality and how we relate to the world and nature, and a more ecological perspective.
For me, at least, I mean, you have the subject matter of this was celebrating 50 years of European Buddhism, or the European Buddhist Union. But for me, the most important thing is that we're addressing these contemporary issues. Now, whether it's about the future of Buddhism in Europe, or it's about the nature of being Buddhist today, we're looking to the future. And as I said at some point during the day, if you take interdependence seriously, then the suffering of any of us humans, any sentient beings, is something we're all implicated in. We're all in some degree implicated in that, and therefore responsible for doing something about it. So I think that this idea that Buddhism is something you do to engage in as a personal practice, gain enlightenment, or at least reduce your stress so you could do a better job of being somebody at work, or a parent, or a friend, and so on, it's all good and it's valuable. But if you take that interdependence seriously, it has to go beyond just your personal worldview, your personal relations, and extend to something bigger.
A transmodern Sangha would see action and contemplation as mutually informing and equally important. So not putting an emphasis on on one or the other, and that there are multiple forms of engagement, and that activism can be meditative. Chanting in protest, walking meditation for climate, digital sanghas for mental health. There are all sorts of authentic modes of Dharma expression considered as activism, not necessarily just simply fighting or protesting. And I would find it very important to include spiritual ecology and interbeing into or engage Buddhist perspective, drawing from Thich Nhat Hanh, deep ecology. I think climate and justice issues are deeply spiritual in nature, and deeply connected and not external. We cannot really dissociate them. And we would need to criticize both modernism and traditionalism in a way, I think. on the one hand, modernism highlights enlightenment as a universal ideology and value. On the other hand, we may consider traditionalism as too rigid, too orthodox. So how about having a view that is pluralistic, that is embodied, that is conversational, dialogical, and circulatory, as I mentioned in my previous talk? Of course, there is a danger to that too, that without some anchoring in tradition, in teachings, in practice, deep practice, this perspective can also become maybe too eclectic in the end or vague in ethical commitment. So we would need to be able to address that while we are working on this form of engaged Buddhism.
If people are engaged in a collaborative activity, then their brain waves will start to resonate with one another. But the important thing is, it's not just that they are engaged in a collaborative activity, they have to believe that they're engaged with another person doing that. The setup of the experimental setup was fascinating, where you were told sometimes you're going to be collaborating with a human being, sometimes you'll be collaborating with an AI. When people believed they were collaborating with another human being, their brain waves resonated with one another. When they believed they were communicating and collaborating with an AI, their brain waves didn't coordinate. They were always collaborating with humans. This tells us that if we consider ourselves to not be collaborating with one another as human beings, whether for political reasons or for other reasons, our basic infrastructure of presence will not resonate together. It gives us an idea of why it is that Dogen, in talking about practice, says, practicing alone is all self. Practicing together is Buddha's. We must practice together, because when we are practicing together with belief in the Dharma, a conviction in those basic values, and we're doing that together, we will resonate with one another, and our whole body, mind, environment complex will come together with the kind of connection that will allow us to actually get things done in the world. We need to transform what matters most, as humanity doesn't just ensure its survival, but takes the real challenge of saying, now we will be responsible for our future evolution. I think that's what's really at stake with engaged Buddhists. Where are we going in evolutionary terms?
So from that perspective, this matter of engagement is already part of the structure of human experience, in the sense that we do share this togetherness in the world. So we are all constructing experience basically in the same way. So we might construct different contents of experience, but we do all share this very fact that we are constructing our experience. We all share these constructions of identity, and this is a reality, this is a matter of fact, but we do not share exactly how this is happening. So like a base for, I think, interconnection comes from this recognition of this universal fact of being subject to the construction of identity and experience. And so the idea of affinity or affinity groups or coming together based on this or that identity is somehow seen through in terms of like a wider, like a deeper, more fundamental sense of sharedness. So the world is already like there at hand. I mean, it's not that I have to connect to the world. We are all constructing the experience of the internal and external world. So this external dimension of mindfulness practice with regard to all areas of subjectivity, embodiment, affect, or the hedonic dimension of experience, and mental states or changing mental states, and what do I do with experience, gearing it towards awakening or non-awakening, which is like a very baseline understanding of the four dimensions of mindfulness. They all come with this injunction to see things externally as much as internally. So this goes to show that engagement is already seen as a fact of experience and is also cultivated actively, intentionally by way of implementing the four establishments of mindfulness with regard to the external dimension of mindfulness. So there isn't much to do about that. I mean, it is just a fact. So as a Buddhist practitioner, I do have the tools to engage with the world, and I also recognize that I am constructing the world in the same way that others are constructing it.
What we're called upon as practitioners is to embrace suffering, is to fully understand dukkha, the condition of conflict and distress and so forth we find in the world. It's not to somehow take as an ontological position, life is suffering. The second task is to let go of our habitual reactive patterns that spontaneously and conditionally arise on encountering suffering or something we desire or whatever. It's about letting that craving be, letting it go, not getting caught up in its narrative. And then, as we do that, we find ourselves engaged with the contemplative task of actually seeing and contemplating the non-reactive mind, which is called different things in different Buddhist traditions. And that depth provides, I think, the source of how the path, the Eightfold Path, then emerges and is cultivated. So I would put as the goal of Buddhist practice not nirvana or enlightenment, but rather this sequence of tasks that leads us into the stream of the Eightfold Path, which we cultivate. And one of the great beauties of the Eightfold Path is that it's not focalized or privileging any particular dimension of our humanity. It includes the way we see the world, the way we think about it, the way we speak, the way we work. It's the totality of our human being that is cultivated on this path. And in this regard, I feel, we might be able to think of the goal of our practice as something, on one hand, complex, more than just getting a deep insight into ultimate truth. And I'm glad that Dhammatina mentioned how in the early text there is no ultimate truth, relative truth. It's a later introduction. It has some use, I admit, but on the other hand, it sets up a binary that I think is extremely problematic. But I do think what the practice calls for is to find a balance and a harmony between the contemplative life and the active life. This is a distinction that goes back to Aristotle in the West, and I find that an extraordinarily useful way to rethink the Eightfold Path as a model that provides a framework for integrating these two dimensions of our humanity. So as to the question, should European Buddhism be engaged? Yes, but carefully defining what that engagement means from a Buddhist perspective. And secondly, integrating engagement as a necessary part of our practice. That my practice of speech, for example, should be just as integral to my practice of Dharma as my practice of meditation. Whereas we tend to privilege one over the other.
In a way, just being in the world is already, as a matter of fact, an engagement with the world. So I don't come from an idea of engagement on top of my normal life in the world or my normal Buddhist practice and relationships. So I think it's inherently engaged, you may say, rather than having to sort of have a meta-discourse or meta-discussion on, does the academic study of Buddhism qualify for engaged Buddhism or it doesn't. That being said, I do think that there is a lot of potential there in terms of really, creating this sense of awareness of the text historical and religio-historical change in Buddhist traditions.
I think what engaged Buddhism leads us to is a question about the balance within our own practice, what we call our practice. Unfortunately, when Buddhists are asked, what is your practice? Often their immediate response is, I practice Zen, or I practice Mahamudra, or I practice Vipassana, or whatever. Practice is seen quite naturally to mean performing a spiritual exercise at different times of the day and going on retreat. That's your practice. I would argue that with the idea of engaged Buddhism, we're trying to expand the notion of practice to include things that are not meditative or spiritual at all. I consider my work as a writer as my practice.
It's very interesting and inspiring for me to see the other points of view, how other people look on exactly the same subject. So it's enriching, and I'm already planning in the few days being back in Poland on the Polish Buddhist Union to repeat several of the points of view, what we can kind of implement in our work over there.
The conference asks very big questions. I'm not sure if they're going to be answers today. Personally, I am a teacher in teacher training, so I train future Buddhist teachers, and I'm very excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to all the information that I will receive to pass it on to my students, who will pass it on to their students. So yes, there will be a lot of impact.
What is very nice is that we have different speakers from different backgrounds, different traditions, different ways of thought about the Buddha's teachings, and altogether it gives a very good panorama of the Buddhist landscape in Europe.
What we can do if we want to establish a European Sangha is to ask ourselves, how do we make these spaces as inclusive as possible, inclusive to people of all genders, all class, or races, all nationalities, all traditions. And what was very interesting to me is that I was sitting outside now, trying to hide and take some more notes. And a lady came to me. Her name is Helena Chang. Unfortunately, she left, but she gave me the consent and blessing to mention this conversation. She's from Blia. And what she said is, Buddhism in Europe is like TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. In Europe, she's based in Austria, I think. So she said that traditional Chinese medicine is regarded as acupuncture, mainly, and not much more. And for her, in her view, with Buddhism, it's a bit the same. And I thought it's very interesting to hear something like this coming from someone who comes from an ethnic background that is traditionally Buddhist. And for me, I think it makes me a little bit sad that she's not here with us explaining this to us. It's a bit sad that she's not here with us to voice that opinion and explain further in which way Buddhism is reduced to just one practice or whatever she acquaints to acupuncture, because it shows us how much we can learn by including or really being proactive in making an effort in including these voices into our European Sangha. And when Johnny raised the question about what happened in the last 50 years, and we came to the realization that 50 years is not a lot, we had a conversation afterwards and we said, that's true, we are still at the beginning of this whole thing, and that means we can still shape it.
Wider discussion, wider discourse, so Sangha as community, it seems that really it's the weakest kind of segment within the European or Western in general Buddhist communities, and I think it does have to do with this theme that's emerged this morning already. So this individualistic project of self-perfection and self-improvement, and it's really interesting because I often see like friends or practicing friends who may get sick or may have financial problems, and everybody's pitying them, but nobody's really doing anything about them. Community doesn't come together. And if you are within traditional Buddhist societies, if like a member is unwell or has temporarily economic problems or is in any kind of troubles, it's totally an organic process. So everybody's kind of coming together because you feel you belong. So there is this sense that at the end of the day, we are, connected, interconnected, but on the ground, I do seem to see far less willingness to really be there for others, in terms of like daily life things, you need to be, driven from A to B, and, who's really going to be willing to help you out, or, you're ill and you have no family members who is really there for you out of your practice community. Yeah, it's a big question. So I think it really points to this individualistic based sort of project and trajectory, which is part of the way Buddhism has been received in the West historically. So it's no wonder it's the way it is, because it's part of the way it's happened. And yeah, I think this is what I wanted to say.
There was never an Asian Sangha. So the idea of a European Sangha is definitely a very, very new thing in the Buddhist world. So you could make the claim, even more controversial, that before 1893 in the Parliament of World Religions that was held in Chicago, most Buddhists around the Buddhist world would not have considered themselves Buddhists. They were members of a particular practicing community with a lineage of teachers and a lineage of texts and a lineage of practices that they engaged in, but there wasn't this overarching sense of, oh, we're all Asian Buddhists together. And that is something that's quite modern. So I think we want to, in the background, keep that in mind. So I think that we have good neuroscientific evidence for why individual practice, solo meditation, solo retreats, as well as group practices put together are very efficacious because it allows us to be present otherwise. Whether that constitutes developing something like a European Sangha, I wonder, because this notion of a Sangha that has a national or continental identity seems to get so generic that I wonder what it would mean to have that support for one another's practice. But then I step back and I put on my modernist robes and I think, but, we do have a need for getting together in ways like a gathering like this, where people from all these different traditions, Theravada traditions, Mahayana, Vajrayana traditions, secular Buddhist traditions, getting together to see what is our shared commitments, what are our shared values here, and how are we going to go about best embodying those, and doing those in a contemporary context where the responsibility traditionally of the Sangha was not just to receive the material support from the lay community. The Sangha had a responsibility to that community as well. It's interdependence between the ordained part of the Sangha and the lay community. So what would our relationship to the wider society be as members of a practicing community? How do we embody the best of our values about living the bodhisattva life, which I think simply stated is, how do we develop the virtuosity to respond to the situations we find ourselves in politically, economically, socially, culturally, in ways that will allow us to contribute to realizing more liberating patterns of relationships? How do we go about doing that? I don't think any of us can do it alone. That's why I quoted these statements from the Zen teachers in Japan. Practicing on your own, at some point, is just about self. Practicing that you're doing together with others, that's where we will find, if we find it at all, or are somehow able to express or embody our Buddha nature, it's going to come from practicing with others.
I think the world we live in, as been mentioned many times, is one in which issues like climate change and all the other issues that seem to engage us now are not solvable by any particular nation or continent or state. And I feel that if Buddhism as an ethical tradition is to be able to rise to the challenges of meeting these, what I think are essentially ethical issues. How do we relate to the environment, to the planet, to the globalization, capitalism, etc.? We need to find an ethic that can respond to those phenomena at a planetary rather than a national or even European scale. The beating heart of Sangha lies in the quality of the relationships we form with others. It's not about joining a club. And I think sometimes people show up at a Buddhist center because they're basically looking for some kind of group of people who think more or less along the same lines, provide certain rituals, help, pastoral care, that they can somehow call upon. And I think that's important. That's certainly part of it. But I feel that Sangha extends both from a handful of people who have deep shared commitments to common values and who connect with each other, who support each other, as well as a sense of belonging to a culture we might call a culture of awakening that is planetary now. I feel that the Dharma can serve as a linking element. It's threads that can pull together people from more and more diverse backgrounds, and that the role of each individual in a Sangha is to support each other in their flourishing as practitioners of the Dharma, just as their presence in your life supports your flourishing. It's a mutual interdependence of allowing the other to become who they could potentially be, without criticism, without judgment. Again, it's a big ask, but I feel that in the world we live today, these are precisely the kinds of values that we are most in need of.
And I think that the term Sangha is also strange, because it's not a sect. It's not even a religion. It's a way of being, but you can find multiple rituals and different styles if you go to different Buddhist countries. And so you can't really say, or you can't really see the exact commonality. So we don't see the exact teaching, we don't see the exact community, we don't see the exact teacher, but there's still something there that exists and that we are related to, that we connect to. And for me, that was liberating when I realized that this vagueness is not a challenge. It might be, but it's an asset. Whoever is here today is the European Sangha, and there may be other gatherings in Europe right now happening at the same time. 2 people, 3 people, 10 people. They are the European Sangha as well, but they are the global Sangha as well. So wherever people share this type of vague, strange commonality, they are part of the Sangha, for me.
We said we would close at 4, so I just want to finish by thanking our panel very, very much for your time. It's been really great to have the day with you.
Pensare al buddismo nei prossimi 50 anni è una questione molto complessa, è imprevedibile come situazioni. L'unica cosa è esplorare delle possibilità, contemplare una possibile accoglienza di quello che verrà, e questo necessita ascoltare più visioni, ascoltare più idee, ascoltare più pareri, mettere attorno allo stesso tavolo visioni che possono essere anche differenti, anche da un punto di vista di metodologia degli interventi e di scambio, e credo che dobbiamo proseguire su questa linea in modo da accogliere anche altri interventi, altri pareri, pensare a una preservazione, pensare a una diffusione, pensare a un'integrazione di quello che sarà e l'apporto che il buddismo potrà dare alla società e quanto sarà il feedback della società nei confronti del buddismo. Credo sia stata veramente una grandissima, bella occasione per ragionare su tanti temi.
It was a really, really important and great event with very important topics. And I take with me a great inspiration to develop the Buddhism the next 50 years.
This conference was a success. The atmosphere was really great, people in dialogue, and the atmosphere in the room was really with great attention, and I think we have just put the seeds for building up a real future European Buddhism.
It's been wonderful to spend this time with such a diverse group of Buddhists from all over Europe. You are part of a community, a Sangha if you wish, that extends right throughout Europe, through different cultures. We had a wide range of ages and genders and so on.
It was really interesting to experience the way in which the group energies sort of worked together over the course of the day. It was pretty impressive that for a program that lasted 8 hours or so.
When I saw the audience and all the people coming from various countries in Europe, I sensed that there is something that unites the people present here, a deep concern for how they see the state of the world.
And it just reminds me of the fact that this is my tribe, as it were. These are people who I don't know, most of them, and yet you feel that sense of affinity and solidarity, a sense of being at home with these people.
The people maintain their energy, their focus, their attention, and I thought that was really a beautiful thing.
I did appreciate the kind of lack of performative attitudes, between all of us. It all felt to me quite natural and spontaneous, and I think we were kind of flowing along nicely together. So far it's been a rather positive experience.